welcome to the turbocamaro.ca video. Today we're doing a pre-ignition checklist and the very first startup ever of this motor. A little bit nervous now, I'm not going to lie. Before I go through the actual turnkey portion, I want to go through this checklist I've made. Now, there's several sources for this checklist. It's not something I've made up off the top of my head. I accumulated several different engine builder checklists and put them into one that was suitable for this engine. This would probably be good for anybody who's building up an inline six of any Chevy or maybe Ford engine, but I don't know exactly. So this has been tuned specifically for this engine build. So you may be able to use pieces of it or all of it for your build. I don't know, and I don't give any kind of warranty for such things. So going through it here, checking out the bolts, oil pan, fuel pump, water pump, valve cover. I've done this already. They're all torqued to spec. Everything's good. Nothing's going to be leaking from any of these places. Sensor ports, the oil, which is above the starter, which is just down in here. Good idea to use pipe tape if you have it on that. Water as above the manifold here. Water temperature sort of dummy light sensor can be here, or the water temperature sensor can be right there. Same idea again, dummy or pipe tape if you have it. And checking the hoses, lines, and clamps. Now I just did most of them not that long ago in the water pump video, and you can see here these are just simple hose clamps. Use a flathead screwdriver for those. Also check, obviously. This is kind of generic, but check all of them. Like, consider checking fuel pump down here. Who knows if these swivel? Give them all a good feel. Touch everything. Make sure everything's good. If you're using AN lines like this, make sure that they're nice and tight as well. You don't want to be fuel splooting out of these when you first start the engine. It's the last thing you need to worry about. Distributor's hooked up. Obviously, it's a bit loose. That's fine. We'll get to that. Coming over here, same idea. AN line for fuel. The last thing you really want is oil or fuel spraying everywhere. These are super tight. I didn't really want this curl in the hose, but since it avoids the fan and then it avoids the belts and stuff, I'll leave it. But everything is ultra tight back here. Same idea. You've got some hoses back here for the distributor and the as well as for the vacuum lines for the transmission and the vacuum gauge inside. So those are all pretty good. No concerns there. Next thing is the spark plug gaps. I've already installed the spark plugs. I gapped them at 45 thousandths because it's an HEI distributor in this, and that's what's designed for. And distributor install. Basically, the rotor, the tang on the rotor is pointed towards cylinder number 1, which is the front one on this engine, and then the spark plug wire is also pointed just sort of towards the corner of the motor, towards even this ground strap here. But yeah, they're both pointed almost in the same direction, and then you've got it. Of course, when the engine is in top dead center. Luckily, this engine, you can actually see the number 1 piston through the spark plug hole come to the top, so it's easy to do without having to manually turn the engine over. If you want to see a video on how to achieve top dead center, there's like 100,000 of them on YouTube, so not to worry about that. Filled the oil filter with a bit of oil. That's obviously here. I just sort of took it off, put in half a cup to a cup of oil, whatever I could do without spilling everywhere, and then just screwed it back in, making sure to get the actual seal of rubber as well with oil, and then actually filling the oil in the engine. And this, you put it in the valve cover here in this chrome filler. Some people like to put it in the dipstick hole. It's way too narrow. I wouldn't waste your time with that. Put in the valve cover, and it'd be a good idea to put in about half as much oil as you need, and then putting in your oil treatment. This is a hydraulic cam, so it needs a zinc-based, phosphorus oil additive. This isn't the one I actually used. I used one by Lucas that's a little bit more expensive and designed for a break-in period. You can see it here. It's in the garbage now, but engine oil break-in additive. It includes the correct amount of zinc to maintain these engine parts. This is what I'll be using for all subsequent oil changes. So that's a good thing to have. Fluid levels, oil, we just did it, so it's not a big deal. Transmission is fine. Checked it. Power steering, was low because of when I was doing the engine bay paint video and things like that. It had a chance to tip, and by tipping it just sort of seeped out of the cap. So it just needed another, half a quart or whatever. And the water I just did as well. You can take a look right now. You can see it right to the top there. That's water. Bloop. Yeah, that's water right there. Keep in mind, there very well will be air in this system. When I start the car, I'll have to keep the cap off to make sure that, do it right now. Keep the cap off, and I might have to top it up. I've got a jug just right over there with some extra distilled water in it. I am running only distilled water in this right now. If there is an engine block leak of water for some reason, I don't need coolant inside the engine block. So strictly just distilled water temporarily. Once it seems to run fine, it's broken in, and there's no major leaks of any kind, I'll likely drain the radiator and replace the radiator with coolant, and that'll give me, around a 50-50 or so. And the belt tension and the condition, these belts are fine. I actually had to get a brand new belt, as I mentioned in the water pump video. I did a new one for this because the pump wasn't clearing the manifold. So that one's nice and tight, and this one is also nice and tight. I probably don't need two belts for this system. I've got one for just the alternator, water pump, and the crankshaft, and then another that just adds the power steering pump. But since my car came with double pulleys, I decided to use them, and I think it kind of acts as like a backup. Worst case scenario, the power steering pump goes, belt goes, and I maintain the other two. So it's kind of I think it's a backup. I think it's a good idea. Cooling fans mounted. Consider an external fan blowing on the radiator for additional airflow. Not a horrible idea. In this case, this is a belt-driven fan. There's no electric fan or clutch fan. It's going to be running the same speed pretty much all the time. I'm not going to be too worried about excess air. And it's a pretty cold day today too, so also not a big deal. You could bring a fan out here and have it point towards the front of the car if you really wanted to. I'm not going to get all excited about that. Ensuring the tank has enough fuel. Fuel that hasn't sat in the tank for a year may not be ideal for a new engine startup. Consider fresh fuel for a fresh engine. That sounds wonderful. In this case, I actually was fairly low. I had about 1/8 of a tank of fuel when I stopped the car last year, and now of course looking at it, I was like, oh shit, I don't have enough fuel for this. So I went out and got another 25 liters of fresh fuel, and that should be just fine now. Tach water oil gauge is installed, or at least temporarily. A tachometer video is done. It's installed on the column like you saw. Water gauge, I don't have a water temperature gauge. It's kind of something in hindsight I wish maybe I did have. However, I do have the dummy light on the dash. God knows if it works. It's the sensors, I bought it last year, so it'll probably work just fine. But who knows if the bulb even works. So maybe a bit of an issue there, but I'll notice issues with that, I think, as we go if I have to. And that's fine. And then oil gauge, yes, I do have the oil pressure gauge. And I do have a fuel pressure gauge here if I need to look at it. And then, of course, there's a vacuum gauge as well in there. And yeah, and the confirm carburetor initial settings, idle mix screws. Idle mix screws in this are supposed to be about 1.5 turns loose. You put them all the way in, pull them back in at 1.5, and that's it. And the accelerator pumps are adjusted to the point where they're tight. So it's a firm, there's no play in them. So everything should be fine with those. Any further adjustments I just can't do until the car is running. Hose and fire extinguisher availability. There's a hose right there for me, which is great. It take me forever to get it actually turned on and over here, but if I had to, it is there. Fire extinguisher I don't have, so that's fine. Priming the oil pump. Now, that's pretty important. Some guys say online, you don't need to, don't waste your time. Basically, what that means is that the distributor goes down into the engine block to the oil pump that's in, it's sort of connected to the crankshaft area, and that's fine, but there's no way to get the oil into the whole engine. Like, you're going to put it in the valve cover up here, it's going to drain down, but it doesn't really coat everything like you'd want it to. And you don't want to crank the engine necessarily to get the oil spread everywhere, because it's it's laborious on the motor and nothing's lubricated yet, so you don't really want to do it like that. So the best way is to have the oil pump go without running the engine. So what I did is I took an old distributor and just basically chopped it up. This is the points distributor that came with the car originally, and I'm not certain it's the stock one or the original one, but it does allow you, with the removal of the heligear at the bottom here, and then just basically the cap and some of the components, it allows you to just basically spin the oil pump, which is what this goes into, without having to run the engine. And then you can I use this, which seems cheesy, Allen key on the drill into the slot here. You can see, I can't do it right now, but that doesn't matter. Basically something like that, but the other way. And that basically allowed me to use the drill at varying speeds to get the oil up. And I could see by looking down in this hole here that the oil was moving around in the valve cover when I was doing that, indicating that there was oil pressure going up into the engine there. And I was checking out the sensor for the oil, making sure there's nothing dripping over there, and just checked around the engine. There's no apparent leaks, so should be good, and there should be plenty of oil circulated in the engine already, which is perfect. And then lastly, now we're on to the last couple steps. Pour a 1/4 cup of fuel in the carburetor just prior to starting. Now that's obviously going to go in here, so I'm going to have to take this off to do that. And I'll probably have to go off video for this because I don't have the gas just standing by here. But I'll get this off here anyway, and you can see it's going to be basically pouring the fuel into the carburetor just on the primary side. Not that that really matters, but get that poured in there. And then it'll be basically start up, should fire up right away, assuming we got spark and all that stuff. And then strongly consider having partners standing by to assist with starting or watching engine for issues. Not a bad idea. I'm probably going to have somebody film the engine bay while I'm filming the interior, just so that I can control the RPM while they make sure there's no crazy fires or have something happening under here. And that's it. I'll read you this step anyway. Turning the key and start the motor. You want to immediately bring the RPM to 2000 and begin varying between 2000 and 2500 for about 25 to 30 minutes. You're going to get some smoke. You're going to get, it's going to be louder than it would normally be. Not that you know what that is yet because you've never started, but it's going to be louder than you'd expect it to be. And just be mindful that it is louder. There is smoke. But if it sounds like bad news, like grinding and some serious problems because maybe your pistons are hitting your valves or something insane like that, then of course you're going to want to shut it down right away because you're damaging components. So if it gets to that point, shut it down. Otherwise, just be aware of these loud volumes and loud noises and stuff, and just be aware that it's going to sound like a mess, and you're just going to want to let it run for that 25 to 30 minutes. There's lots of people online that say 15 to 20 minutes is fine. There's lots of people that say 1500 to 2000 RPM is good. I took the average of everything and found that most of the people that seem to matter say 2000 to 2500, so we're going to go with that. And then after that's all done, you're going to run that engine for 30 minutes or so, shut it down, let it cool off, and you're going to drain the oil. It's, you know, we just put this oil in and we paid for this money for the additive, but basically you're going to want to swap the oil out right away. There could be, you know, sediment in there and deposits and all kinds of leftovers, you know, foreign debris and stuff like that that's in the engine from when you you know, when you put it together, that you want out of there as quickly as possible. So do that. And then from there, it's just a matter of running the engine. You're going to want to do the timing, you're going to want to do carburetor adjustments, and get the car out on the road. Take it to the highway if you can. Don't want to go nuts with it. Again, that's another sort of a thing that not everybody will agree with. You're going to have people say, you know, run it to the ground right away, you know, push the thing as hard as you can. And then there's going to be other people that say, you know, just go easy on it for so many kilometers. And I'm under the impression that, you know, take it easy for the first 500 or so kilometers, 600 kilometers maybe. Then you're going to do another oil change. And then at that point, you could start to, you know, lay into it a little bit. But that, you know, that's my opinion, and that's what, you know, from what I've read. So you might want to consider some other things. So let's go ahead and put some fuel in there and get this thing started. Half a cup of fuel is poured in the primary side of the carburetor, and everything seems to be good to go. I'll have to monitor the coolant level as it's running initially, but other than that, we'll just be checking for all the normal leaks and stuff. Change in plans, I'm going to be moving this to a part 2 for the engine start, just so anybody else doesn't need to watch this whole bit before they see the part they actually came for. So thank you again for watching, and check out turbocamaro.ca, and we'll see you in part 2.